Hey everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Why Don't You Want My Stuff? Today is something I'm very passionate about, and that is musical instruments, specifically vintage guitars. I used to own a vintage music store. I used to play in rock bands. I just love the guitar. I think it's a wonderful instrument, and I just think everybody should learn to play one at some point in their life. I find it therapy. It's amazing. Anyway, I want to talk about vintage musical instruments, and I really want to speak from the 1920s moving forward. The guitar specifically has just done nothing but appreciate in value, and I paint with a broad brush, but I'm not kidding. I mean, they really have. I've seen the trends, your 1930s and 40s Martins and Gibsons, and then in your 50s and 60s Fenders, the amplifiers, the guitars themselves. The prices have just constantly trended up, and it's a wonderful thing if you're a collector. Some of these got actually priced out of the player's pocketbook, like you couldn't afford them, and they started going overseas and going into museums, and so the collector started giving up on like the 50s and 60s and then collecting the 70s. Let me give you an example. When I used to have a vintage music shop in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, and one of the things, the old Fenders, the 60s Fenders, everybody wanted, but the 70s were not considered by the players to be the ones you wanted, because it wasn't the ones the guys in Cream were using, or Black Sabbath, etc., etc. They weren't playing those guitars. You wanted the 60s guitars because that's what they were playing. Well, then it moved into the 70s. It was like, you know, Ace Frehley, and you wanted the Kiss, you wanted the Les Paul Customs, and you started to want those musical instruments. Well, then it moved into the 80s and 90s, and you know, players like Kurt Cobain, who they couldn't afford these really fancy instruments, were buying Fender Jaguars and Mustangs and Jazzmasters and guitars that were very inexpensive at this time in the early 90s. And now those guitars are in the several $1,000s because the player wants what the player had that they, you know, look up to. And as far as a musician goes, they may not be some of the best playing instruments, but they might have a particular sound. But across the board, we've noticed guitars from the 50s, 60s, and 70s just constantly maintaining their value or appreciating. We can't say that about a lot of other collectibles. So guitars and musical instruments have really followed that trend. I see it in saxophones. We see it in trumpets. These are the things that people put out at yard sales and estate sales. You'll go out and they'll be like, oh, here's my son's old trumpet. He played in high school. He was pretty good. He had a King trumpet. And they think it's worth $75 because they might have paid $150 for it when it was new. Well, today online, that could be a $600, $700 instrument. And they've just done nothing but appreciate. Now, mind you, with some of the old woodwinds and brass instruments, if they go into the 19th century, the 1890s and 1910, 1920, some of those actually don't have the same keying and play the same way, so a lot of people aren't collecting them. There's not a big demand for them other than wall hangers. You know, same goes with a lot of instruments like that. Like violins, there are some periods of violins that, you know, everyone thinks they have an old Stradivarius, and it's not. It's a copy, and it might have been a lesser quality, made in the 20s or 30s, might be a couple $100 instrument. However, again, as I always say, ask an expert. Now, electric guitars, I'll tell you, one of those things with electric guitars is some of the 60s and 70s freak shows that were out there, the Japanese guitars that when I was big in the guitars in the 90s, you couldn't sell them for $50. Nobody wanted them. As a player, they weren't that good, and they had all these weird sound effects built in them, and they just weren't. Today, again, $1,500, $2,000, because the collectors who remember them fondly, or the kid that played them when they were a kid, wants that guitar. They want what they wanted when they were a kid. I'll talk about that a lot. The trend, same with cars, toys, it always seems to be what you wanted when you were a kid and couldn't afford, when you have disposable income, becomes your desire. Supply and demand, there's the demand. So it follows musical instruments, but I haven't seen the downward that I've seen in other trends and other collectibles I had discussed. I don't know if I've talked about it yet, but I beat a dead horse with it. In toys, you saw the prices start to fall in the 50s and 60s toys because those collectors weren't still collecting them. Now with guitars, that's not the case. In the 50s and 60s, they're still, because again, the musicians had a larger spread of time where they might have enjoyed that instrument. So if you like Led Zeppelin and he liked a guitar from the 50s or 60s, and you still like Led Zeppelin, you still want that guitar from the 50s or 60s, even though it's not something you, born in the 70s or 80s, was exposed to, like with toys. So that's my thought. I like to I'm always learning about the psychology. If there's any psychologists out there, I welcome you to chime in and tell me your thoughts, because there might be something real to it. Because Snapcat, always remember, Snapcat. I don't know where Snapcat came from. I was just starting it because somebody got me this t-shirt and I thought it would make a great end of this video. That just shows how much common sense I got. Anyway, take care. I will see you later. Next episode will probably be shot in a different t-shirt 5 minutes from now.
Nigga wanna see me fall. Stephen Curry, how I ball. Gosha garments and a white 3 on my